Good evening and welcome to episode 272 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Muziwakhe. It's the Wednesday edition of the Private Property Podcast. If you're joining us for the first time, you've been missing out on quite a number of great episodes. So do make sure that you go to our Facebook or our YouTube page to catch up on all the great episodes that you've already missed out on. To all our regular viewers, welcome back. You know how we do it. Every single weekday at 7 p.m., you and I have an appointment where I'm always in conversation with an expert who helps us navigate our property journey. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking to buy, to sell, to build, or perhaps just want to get a bit of knowledge when it comes to all things property. This is the show that caters to all of your property needs. It is, of course, the only daily property talk show in South Africa. So we certainly are here to help you along your property journey. And talking about helping you along your property journey, there are also a whole host of other shows that you can tune into across Private Property's social media pages. As it is a Wednesday, you can look forward to the First Time Home Buyers show later on this evening at 8 p.m. brought to you by Esther Clarkson. And she's always in conversation with somebody who's walked that first time home buying journey. They get to share some of the lessons learned, mistakes that they've made, and of course, how they've gone on to grow their property portfolio beyond that first purchase. And if you've got green fingers and want to explore all things agriculture, you want to make sure that you tune into award-winning farmer Muziwakhe's farming podcast that comes to your screens every single Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I saw the episode yesterday. I think one of the great things, they were looking at the Cooler app and the brains behind the Cooler app and some of the great work that they're doing. Those are some of the insights that you're able to get. And it doesn't matter where in the agricultural value chain you have an interest in. Umbali certainly has different conversations with different stakeholders that help you on your agriculture journey. Every Mondays and Friday, Chad takes us through breathtaking homes all across the country on the Home Shoppers Show. So you can have a sneak peek of some of the amazing homes that we get to list on www.privateproperty.co.za. Now, those are some of the great shows that you can look forward to here on Private Property beyond this show. So every weekday at 8 p.m., we still have your property needs covered. So do make sure that you continue following us. And if you're not following us on our other platforms, do make sure that you follow us there. We are now also on TikTok, and you'll get to be able to watch Chad and Esty certainly bring you great content on that platform. You can follow myself at _K on Twitter as well as on Instagram. Now, this evening, we have a guest that we always speak to once a quarter. Him and I have a conversation. Every time we wrap up our conversation, we always say, I'll see you next quarter, because we'll be exploring something that, of course, the data that they would have went through, I think, two quarters ago. And this evening, we're speaking, of course, to Muziwakhe, who's the manager of analytics for Absa Home Loans. So looking at Absa's insights into Q1 for 2021 of their homeowners sentiment index. And if you still don't know, what the sentiment index is about, why it's so important, and of course, some of the great insight that it has. And this is the show that you can certainly get a better sense of. Muzi, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us again this evening.
Good evening, Zama. How are you doing this evening?
I'm absolutely fantastic. I always say whenever you and I, chat analytics and look at some of the, insights, certainly from your homeowner sentiment index, it's always so great, because I think one of the great things is we say to homeowners or even property investors that you want to get a sense of what kind of data is available out there, and data that you can probably use to make, or better make some of your property decisions. And this is probably one of that, data outputs that is very useful for not just homeowners, but also, of course, people who are investing in property. But before we look at some of the results, what it says, perhaps let's, unpack what exactly is the homeowner sentiment index for viewers at home who don't have a sense of what it is.
So the homeowner sentiment index started when we were trying to gain, a bit more insight in terms of what do retail potential retail customers think about the property market. So we don't necessarily talk to industry stakeholders or industry aggregators such as estate agents or mortgage originators, or even talk amongst ourselves as financiers. We go to the individuals who are going to be making the buying and selling decision ultimately, and we try to get a sense from them or get a feel in terms of how they're currently feeling about the property market. We measure a couple of things, and then we track those over time, and they really give us a nice read over time in terms of how are people feeling about the property market in South Africa.
And I think for people at home who still probably might not be able to make the connection, why track this particular sentiment? Because I mean, you've so rightfully highlighted that you don't look at stakeholders within the industry or professionals within the industry, but you're essentially looking at the consumers themselves. So why track this particular index? Why is it such an important index essentially to be able to track and keep record of? I mean, we've been having a conversation with you every quarter as we always unpack the latest on this particular matter.
Yeah, it gives a really nice read in terms of the customer landscape. So if you're a property investor, it's really nice because you kind of get a read of what a certain segment of the population or how they're thinking about the property industry. You might be very interested in how are renters thinking about the property industry. If you're a property owner, you might be thinking about, or you might be interested in, how do people feel about selling property right now, so that you can try and get a read of, should I sell my property now? Should I hang on to it for another month or three? It gives a nice additional lens through which people can look at their own personal property ownership journey, and then understand how other people are thinking about their own journeys as well.
I think before we even look at the Q1 data and what the sentiment is for Q1, perhaps give us a sense of the overall sentiment from last year. I know we track it almost per quarter, maybe a highlight of some of the surprises that you saw as you're tracking the various quarters last year, before we dig into what Q1 of 2021 looks like.
Yeah, so thinking about sentiment over the past year, kind of if we rewind to the beginning of last year, we had no idea that COVID was gonna sort of spread across the globe as rapidly as it did and have such a profound impact on pretty much everything that we did. In Q1, sentiment was looking okay. Like it wasn't necessarily shooting the lights out, but it was also not down in the doldrums. And then by the time we started measuring Q1 sentiment towards the end of Q1, around March, is when we were having lots of conversations about hard lockdown. So if you guys remember, nicely, we were pretty much not allowed to do anything. The army was out on the road, the cops were out on the road, you weren't even allowed to go for a jog. Sentiment took a bit of a dip because there was quite a bit of uncertainty and people didn't know what's going to happen in the economy. And then we had a series of interest rate cuts during Q1 and some very deep ones during Q2. And then when those interest rate cuts actually happened, it stimulated quite a bit of activity towards the end of Q2, and we've kind of been riding that momentum for the better part of the past year. We currently in Q2 right now, when we looked at our own internal data, it's pretty much where we saw application volumes recover and exceed pre-lockdown levels. So the interest rate cuts have really carried us quite a long way, and we've kind of never really looked back in terms of that. I think for me that was still one of the biggest surprises that we saw then.
And if you look at last year, and we'll go through the different set that you essentially track, but when you look at last year, were there any surprises in the index across the different quarters?
Yeah, the biggest surprise I think was overall sentiment recovered. But the one thing that kind of didn't happen was sentiment towards selling property. And what that resulted in is we kind of saw this widening gap between sentiment towards buying property versus sentiments towards selling property. Sentiment towards buying property pretty much recovered. It's currently continues to be the highest we've recorded since we launched the sentiment index in 2015, and sentiment towards selling still hasn't recovered to pre-lockdown levels. So we continue to see this widening gap between willing buyers and willing sellers, and that's got some very interesting implications attached to that.
I mean, I can imagine. I think more often than not, people who are looking to sell right now, some of them are probably slightly disgruntled, maybe selling because they can no longer afford to sell. Some probably thought, look, this may be a good time to sell, but they're not making as much from that property as they thought that they were going to make. With others obviously not pricing their property properly and it's staying on the market for an extended period of time. So I can probably see why the sentiment towards selling is not as well as the sentiment towards buying. I think there are probably more people who are able to find good deals right now, regardless of what we look at as a good deal. But more than anything, they are spoke for choice. So if you're not going to get, unit 5 in a particular complex, chances are unit 25 is available. So your confidence when it comes to buying is certainly going to be much better, and your sentiment towards buying is certainly going to be much better relative to those who are selling. Now, Muzi, before we even get into the 2021 Q1 data, let's look at firstly the overall sentiment for Q1, because the one question I've been asking a lot of my guests off air, especially as we began the year and throughout Q1, was how is business doing during Q1, right? And with some of them, January, February, that say, look, we're actually doing much better than we had anticipated. Others, I mean, there was a guest of air who said February was their best month since they started their business, and the business is something like over 5 years old. And they were thoroughly surprised that they even had to bring in, additional manpower to help them deal with the demand. They had actually planned that January, Q1, they thought this was going to be very slow. And I think he was even saying that he was going to take leave. Another colleague of his that handles quite a huge bulk of the work was also going to be taking leave. And they planned it like that because they thought these are usually our quiet times. So we can afford to just have thin staff and everything is going to work out, only for the complete opposite to happen. So what is the overall sentiment for Q1 of this year?
Yeah, so sentiment for Q1 inched 1% ahead of Q4. But just bearing in mind that it's only 1% ahead of a very high base. So we saw quite a recovery last year already. So where sentiment is sitting, it's quite a good space. So I think it's looking good for the property industry, and the underlying factors remain largely unchanged. It's largely around the belief that people have. It's almost like this renewed belief that people had that property is a good investment. It was always increase in value, and it's a great investment. Is where we're sitting in terms of overall sentiment towards buying property specifically, that also inched ahead of where it was in Q1 to currently be the highest levels that we've seen since we launched HSI in 2015, and also sentiment towards buying rather than renting is also the highest that it's been since we launched the index. And then if we look on the selling side, sentiment towards selling is still a bit low, and that's what I was alluding to say, if sentiment towards buying continues to grow, and sentiment towards selling continues to lag, we've got this widening gap, with more willing buyers and fewer willing sellers.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things with willing or unwilling sellers is there's quite a lot of expectation management that needs to occur from the seller side. Because I think people who need to downscale aside, you certainly do have sellers or prospective sellers who've got quite a few properties in their portfolio. Perhaps they're looking at offloading some of those properties, as I was saying earlier. And a lot of them have unrealistic expectations about what they want to get in terms of returns from that property. And we're seeing it in some of the prices that you'd even find on private property.co.za when you look at some of the properties that some of the asking price is quite high, and they already sort of put themselves out of the possibility of getting a buyer who isn't only willing to be qualified as a serious buyer, but I think we're finding that we're not seeing as many serious sellers, unfortunately, which is something that we certainly need to work on. And I urge sellers to also do their research out there, because you need to manage your own expectations of what you're going to get for your property. That's so crucial, especially if you're a serious seller. I mean, if you really desperately need to offload that particular asset, then you need to sit down, do the numbers. Perhaps you may take a knock on that particular property. Is it worth taking that knock if that particular property is bleeding you dry? If so, take the knock and pick yourself up. Otherwise, if you can afford for that property to stay on the market for an extended period of time, then I suppose that's what you're going to do. I want to find out from the viewers at home if you've seen that trend. I mean, what have been some of the trends that you've seen, certainly from, we'll say from last year this time, so in the past year, when it comes to the property prices, and if you've been able to buy, were you able to sort of negotiate slightly lower than what you thought you were going to be able to buy for, or was the seller sort of not willing to be negotiable on their price? And from the seller side, how has your experience been in selling your property? Have you found that you were able to get the price that you wanted? Did you sort of start on the higher end and work your way down with some of the prospective buyers were putting in offers, or you are very clear that this is actually the sweet spot price point, and we're very persistent with the estate agent that you are working with? Do share your experience down here below. I certainly want to hear from you. Now, Muzi, I know one of the things that we also, track, one of the indices that you also track is, of course, investing in property. Perhaps tell us how that particular one went, especially when you sort of when you compare it to the past, certainly let's say the past year, because we've been speaking to you now for a good year.
Yeah, so sentiment towards investing also showed a strong recovery into Q1, which was quite interesting. So if we double click on sentiment towards investing and we look at the population that has investment properties that generate an income, that portion or that segment of respondents actually didn't have such a strong rebound, and it was mostly first-time property owners and non-first-time property owners who thought, hey, it's a really great time to be investing in property right now. And then I think something that kind of goes hand in hand with sentiment towards investing in property is the sentiment towards buying versus renting. So it's a question that we ask, is it a good time to buy or is it a good time to rent? There as well, when we double click and get into sort of the next level of detail, we start seeing a couple of things. I think this is more self-selection bias. The people who are currently renting think it's a good idea to rent, and the people who own property generally think that it's a good time to buy. The one thing that would be renters or people who still say it's a good idea to rent, what they have mentioned, or something that we've started picking up that they're mentioning and bringing up right now is firstly just around, there's still a number of people who have income uncertainty, and they said maybe it's a good time or it's a good idea to continue renting until there's a little more certainty. And then the other thing that's started coming up is around the incidental costs of owning property. So people have started talking about, conveyancing fees, registration fees. They've started talking about
levies,
maintenance, levies, rates and taxes, and all of that. It's quite interesting because I think when interest rates were cut initially and for the past couple of quarters, we actually didn't hear much feedback in terms of those things, but it came across quite strongly amongst those who are renting. And then incidental property ownership costs such as maintenance, repairs, rates and taxes. Non-first-time property owners also came out and mentioned those quite a bit.
And Muzi, I think when we look at something like that, it is one of those things that as a homeowner, you would So especially if you're one who's a new homeowner, you're not used to dealing with some of your own maintenance. You certainly were not used to paying for levies, and you now have this new cost, right, that you hadn't planned for. With some people, two months into owning your property and that bond installment has gone off twice, then your geyser bursts, and if you're staying in a sectional title community, you still have to pay for the access. And if it so happened that you bought a freestanding property, then you have to go buy the geyser yourself. You have to plan for the plumber to come in. If there's any damage that was caused by the geyser burst, you have to cover that yourself. Whereas when you were renting, that's something that the landlord would have to sort out. So that transition can be quite a painful and traumatic transition when you 100%. Are not used to it. We're going to take your questions and comments at home as we unpack Absa's insights into Q1 of the 2021 Homeowners Sentiment Index. We've got here coming through from YouTube. I'll ask Leander who this person on YouTube is, saying that from Q1 results, how's the picture regarding the market? Are people buying below or above market related value?
Yeah, so in terms of the HSI Zaman buying above and below, so we don't measure that directly, but we do have a little bit of insight in terms of sentiment towards buying versus sentiment towards selling. And as I mentioned, we saw this widening of sentiment towards buying versus sentiment towards selling, and I think some of the things that I would encourage everyone to have a look at, and I think you hit the nail on the head. The one thing that's definitely useful to look at or consider is whether are we starting to have more people who are paying the asking price for properties versus getting a bit of a discount. I think that'll normally be a sign in terms of, well, property prices are starting to rise when we are seeing more and more sellers getting their asking price. It will also sort of evidence itself when we start seeing shorter and shorter time between advertising properties and getting offers, where sellers are starting to receive multiple offers and be able to compare those, because there's a series of things that need to happen before we actually see the general price level start to increase. And I think one of the things that's happened over the past year is when we had this influx of demand, there was still quite a lot of stock available for sale, and stock that was put in the market before lockdown, stock that was put in the market during lockdown, and even after hard lockdown, before we all started thinking about, well, our property prices potentially outgrowing inflation for the first time in a long time. And I think those are the properties that will kind of absorb price increases, I think, in the short to medium term. But I think we're at the pointy end now. I think the properties where bargains can still be struck, I think, are going to start running a bit thin, and then we're going to start potentially seeing the overall price go up. Another interesting data point, that kind of talking about are people getting their asking prices or not, is that in Q4 of last year, mortgage loans and advances, so total loans that were advanced to people to buy property, was the highest of all time. So we saw a massive recovery. Financiers clearly came to the party, and in Q4 we shattered all previous records, and I think that does talk to, there's a lot of demand, people are financing their properties, we are seeing higher loan to values or lower deposits being put down, and the credit quality continues to be there, I think, is the most exciting part for me.
And Muzi, when you talk about that Q4 record, is that across Absa Home Loans, across all financial institutions?
It's across all financial institutions.
Oh, wow.
So on average, banks have lent more, or have lent the most that they ever have last quarter, well in Q4.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that that is the case, because I mean, one of the questions that I've even asked some of your colleagues in previous shows, particularly last year, as the country was slowly opening up, was whether people's home loans are being granted, whether banks are in fact, granting people's home loans, because there was also a sense from a lot of consumers that they can't get a home loan right now, even people who were working and working full time. So there certainly was a bit of a fear factor going around that if you're looking for a home right now, banks are not necessarily extending that credit facility. So to find that in Q4 it was the all-time highest is clearly sentiment that banks are not only open for business, but you certainly are able to get a home loan in particular as a credit facility. Now, Muzi, one of the other indices that of course track is the one around renovating your property, and this one is an interesting one that I want to find out what the Q1 this year's sentiment was, because I saw a lot of us last year. I mean, obviously, we were spending more time at home than we previously have ever spent before. Many people started various DIY projects in their homes and projects that they've been putting off and saying, I'll get to it. What was the sentiment for Q1 of this year when it comes to renovations in a property?
Yeah, sentiment towards renovation stayed flat. So in Q1, it was exactly where it was in Q4. But 100% agree with you. Last year, quite a bit of growth that we saw in sentiment towards renovating property as people were forced into their homes, and people were entertaining more at home. People were staying more at home. It was a great idea. The one interesting thing, or the one new trend that we picked up in Q1, is that people were starting to say, property renovations are an opportunity to improve security of properties.
And Muzi, as we begin to wrap up, I want to get a sense from you then of the provincial breakdown, because I mean, I know you're also able to just get a sense of what the sentiment is across the provinces. Any surprises when it comes to how the respondents from different provinces shared their views across the different indices that we've gone through?
Yeah, so not necessarily. I think the only one where I kind of had to do a double take was the Western Cape. So the Western Cape had a 5% increase in terms of overall sentiment, and I think that's because sentiment was lagging the other two big provinces for a couple of months. But KZN and Gauteng pretty much remained flat or the same as where they were in Q4, and then we had the Western Cape with that massive recovery, and the Western Cape I think currently has the highest overall sentiment.
And Muzi, the one question I always ask you whenever I speak to you and I put you on the spot, what can we expect for Q2, or what's your sense of what could potentially happen for Q2 this year? I know you don't like that one. I know, and I always put you on the spot with this one, because it's always just great to get a sense from you about where you think we might be in the next quarter.
Yeah, I think what we'll probably see in the next quarter, I suspect sentiment will kind of remain where it is. Will kind of remain quite flat. I know we had a couple of quarters of very riveting looking at the numbers quarter on quarter, but as my boss told me on Monday, it's very difficult to stay exciting for a not so exciting guy, and I think that's kind of what sentiment is going to start doing. I think we're kind of plateauing. The one thing that I'm very interested in keeping a close eye on is that sentiment towards selling, because it has not recovered by a long shot. So pre-lockdown, we were sitting at about 40%. In Q1, we're still sitting at about 33%. So we haven't recovered to pre-lockdown levels. But what I do suspect is going to happen, I suspect we're going to have quite a bit of price support on properties continuing. I've heard stories of sellers selling a property and getting multiple offers in the first week that they put it on the market. So we're definitely starting to see or get that evidence that we've been waiting for a couple of months, where stock levels have come down quite a bit, and I think we we're definitely at that point where we're turning, and I'm sure there's areas where we've already turned, where sellers are putting their properties on the market, sometimes potentially even getting offers for more than what they asked for. And I think sentiment towards selling is going to potentially go through that recovery.
I think one thing that would be interesting to track, Muzi, for me, would be the sentiment when it comes to interest rates, especially because the way one views interest rates prior to buying a property is very easily very different from when you actually own a property. Sometimes you might think it's not worth fighting for that 0.25% from the bank, and when we look at it in everyday 0.25%, you think, that's not even 1%, it's not much. But when you actually have a home loan and you're able to get that difference, and you slowly look at the interest rate decreases in the past year to 14 months, people are starting to see the difference that the interest rate has fundamentally had, and are getting more and more conscientized around interest rates and their relationship with, of course, their home loan. Starting to even approach different banks to maybe see if they're able to, switch banks or even negotiate with their own bank around their interest rates. So I think that would be an interesting sentiment to get a sense of. I mean, I know that for the most part, interest rates don't go up and down very often. I mean, they're not that volatile. If anything, I'd say we've been fortunate during this period that we've had so many, back-to-back decreases. Of course, now they've sort of remained the same. So a lot of us probably would have wanted another decrease to get that. But before I let you go, Muzi, I see that one of our viewers who's watching us on YouTube, Muziwakhe, has actually asked where, firstly, his comment is great. He's actually said great stuff and thanks, and fam, saying thank you, fam. The guest just answers the question spot on, and he goes on to ask, the results that we're going through this evening, where can they get the information around the sentiment?
So Zintle's not going to be happy with me because she has made a plan to make the report more easily accessible. Pop an email to us at Absa Home Loans at absa.co.za. So that's Absa Home Loans, one word, at absa.co.za. But we're also making plans to make it available on our website on absa.co.za. If you go through to the home loans page, we're going to try and see how we can add those all of our reports on there to make it as easily accessible as possible. And Zama, I don't know if it's even possible to share material on Facebook.
It is possible. So I think you can get it with the team. We're able to share it down here in the comments below. I mean, I know Zinke has sent me the index. I was actually about to check. I'll forward it to the team. I know that they are able to put it on our Facebook page. But as you're saying, we don't want Uzinhle, and this is Muzi's colleague to kill us, so we'll definitely share it down here below. From the show, I know we'll have you back at. And that is Muziwakhe Zim, who is the manager of analytics for Absa Home Loans. And that certainly brings to an end of our show this evening, Private Property Podcast with myself, Uzamanto. And I see that the network is slowly trying to fail us. It's probably my cue to go. I have overstayed my welcome. So thank you very much for tuning in. It is the end of the show. I'll be back on your screens tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Until then, hoping you're staying home and staying safe.